I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Al Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London with an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. London is, of course, the capital of a major economy, the fifth or sixth largest in the entire world, which has just decided a few weeks ago to leave the European Union. Britain was late in joining the European Union, didn't join until 1973. The French had originally intended to keep Britain out, and most of Britain didn't really want to be in. And then we did, and now we don't. We have tasted it, and it didn't taste very nice, at least for the mass of the ordinary people. The people who had tended to vote to remain in the European Union, the people who had not decided they wanted to leave. The experience had not been a beneficial one for them. That's something that cannot be gainsaid. There's no one can second guess the electorate. More than 17 million people in Britain voted to leave the European Union. That's more people than have ever voted for anything in the entire history of democracy in this country. It upset a lot of apple carts, the entire political class, all of the leadership of the country, all of corporate power, all the banks, all the big businesses, all the employers' organizations, all the big broadcasters, all the main liberal and centrist media. All of them wanted us to say yes, but we said no. So there's no going back, although there may be attempts by one or two in the political class to try and run this thing again until they get the result that they would have preferred. But that isn't going to happen, because that would risk social peace in the country, and it's not a risk that the British ruling elite are in any kind of position to take. So we are leaving the European Union. The only question is when and on what terms. The President of the European Union has told, his word, the British Prime Minister that it must be a velvet divorce. Well, anyone who's ever been through a divorce knows that there is no velvet divorce. So we can expect some thrills and spills along the way. But what we're going to discuss this evening is not whether Britain should leave the European Union. That's already decided. But what Britain's foreign policy will be in the wake of our withdrawal, how that will impact upon the European Union's foreign policy, and of course its domestic policy, and what it will mean therefore for world affairs. I personally put it this way: there is no guarantee that Britain will have a better foreign policy now that we're leaving the European Union, but we could not have had a better foreign policy if we had remained. Because the European Union is a political expression of the military alliance of NATO, which depends, as did the European Union, on the hegemony of the United States. In other words, leaving the European Union is a necessary but not sufficient condition for Britain playing a better role in the world. Put it this way: our foreign policy will henceforth be decided by a British government in a British parliament elected by British people. And if the British people don't like the foreign policy that the British government is following, then it now has the power to change it, democratic power to change the British government. At the time of recording, at least, the opposition in Britain is led by a man that wants to change Britain's foreign policy direction. Jeremy Corbyn, with whom I sat in Parliament for almost 30 years, and marched on the streets of Britain for almost 40 years is a man like me. That's why they hate him in the corridors of power. He's opposed all the wars, all the crimes, all the imperialist outrages in which Britain has been involved, not just in our lifetimes, but historically too. He's determined that Britain should forge a different path in the world, and I hope that he gets the chance to do so. But at least it will be us that decides whether or not he does. And so, how will that impact? Well, some people say that Britain will become more dependent on the United States. I don't see that at all. That would be jumping out of the frying pan and into the fire. In any case, we've managed to combine very neatly being in the European Union and in the pocket of the United States, as are most of the European Union countries. The impact on the world, therefore, will be this. The European Union will be considerably weaker now that Britain has decided to leave, particularly if, as is likely, other European Union countries decide they want to do the same. If you had a referendum tomorrow in the European Union asking the citizens of the European Union if they wanted to join the European Union, it would be laughed out. There would be no need to count the votes. You could just weigh them. So the European Union will be much weaker for Britain leaving. The Eurozone will be stress-tested into oblivion if Britain leaves the European Union in the next couple of years. Greece and other countries are going to have to default. You can't have a European Union that's imposing sanctions on its own members because they won't implement economic policies to the liking of the European Central Bank and the Commission. Therefore, Europe will be less of a player in international affairs, and that's a good thing, because Europe's playing in international affairs is merely as an adjutant to the United States of America, which has its own problems, of course. It will mean that the rising mass populations of the East and the South will have more of a chance of following their own path to development, prosperity, stability, and peace. The greatest of those are the BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, joined by Iran, other emerging powers like Malaysia, Indonesia in the East, and of course the whole question of Africa as yet unresolved. Which way will Africa go? Will it continue to be a bank to be plundered by the predators of multinational globalization, or will it be able to form its own approach to development and stability? These are the questions that we are going to discuss tonight with this fine audience. Dr. James, I must go to you first, not least because you've got the microphone.
Well, thank you, George. I'd like to know whether you think it's likely that because the European Union has been slightly more supportive of the Palestinians than Britain, which is responsible for its plight, has been, and given that Mr. Hammond, our former or present, I can't remember where he is now,
Chancellor of the Exchequer,
when he was Foreign Secretary, he said...
Picking your pocket as we speak.
He said that when he was Foreign Secretary, he said he was proud of the fact that Britain was leading the sanctions, the European sanctions against Russia, stirring up that little hornet's nest of potential war. Now, that can't happen so easily now, assuming that we were actually driving that, and he was right. Is it therefore likely that without us in Europe, and bearing in mind what you've said about Europe's being driven by America, which of course is a downside of this possibility, do you think that the Middle East might be more favorably dealt with by the European countries than it has been so far?
Well, I want imperialism to be weakened everywhere. And if the European Union is weakened in its resolve to pursue imperialist policies, if the United States is less and less able to pursue them, both because of its own internal problems. I mean, the United States looks to me like it's on the cusp of civil war, racialized civil war. If both of these parties are no longer able to storm around the world kicking over other people's governments, that's a very good thing. It's important to make the point that this last period has been one long round of sanctions. The European Union has sanctioned Iran, it sanctions the Palestinians, it reverse sanctions the Palestinians, it sanctions the Palestinians and rewards Israel for its crimes against them. It has sanctioned Russia, and it has moved with its military arm NATO, literally its tanks and guns onto the lawn of Russia, and openly threatening Russia with military action. Britain itself, with all our problems, imagine, currently has soldiers in Ukraine, where there's a war going on, has soldiers in Poland, soldiers in the Baltic. We're attempting to draw a new front line through some living room in Latvia, and telling our people that they have to be ready for their sons to give their life's blood in defense of it when no one's even threatening it. So I think, and I've said this to you often, and I think you agree, the key for the Palestinian people doesn't lie in Europe. If everybody in Britain supported the Palestinians, it would be a very good thing. If the whole parliament did, it would be a very good thing. But it wouldn't free Palestine. Palestine is an Arab issue. It is a Muslim issue. There are more than enough Arabs and more than enough Muslims to solve it. They don't need to wait for Godot in the form of Philip Hammond, whoever he is. If he came in here, nobody here would know him. He's not going to liberate Palestine. The Arabs and the Muslims and the Palestinians themselves have to liberate Palestine. Who'd like to go second? Young lady at the next to you.
What do you think is the reason behind all the racism in Europe that appeared suddenly? Or it's always been there, but after, I think, the Brexit, it's expanding and increasing a lot. What we see in Paris, in the UK itself, around Europe, it's something which is unusual. There must be a reason behind it. There must be something that happened and triggered that reason.
Only someone as delightfully young as you could imagine that this is new. European racism has the deaths of hundreds of millions of people, the blood of hundreds of millions of people on its hands. Let's take France. France murdered 2 million Algerians who rose up for their freedom and independence from French colonial rule. Let's take Belgium. Belgium raped the Congo of its wealth, of its people, and carried out the biggest act of looting of national treasure ever known in the history of mankind. Little Belgium, who would have thought it? All of the European countries, Italy, Spain, France, Britain, have conquered, looted, murdered, and massacred people of color everywhere they've ever gone. In the case of the British and the Dutch, particularly, we didn't just steal their things, we stole the people themselves, chained them, put them in ships, sailed them to the so-called New World, and put them to work in the fields as slaves. So there is nothing new about European racism. The reason for racism now is the same as the reason for racism then. Then we regarded ourselves as a superior race, white Europeans who had a right to go to other people's countries and loot them. There's a man sitting next to you from India. Let's just take one part of India, Bengal. When the British arrived in Bengal, it was the richest place on the earth. And when the British left Bengal, it was the poorest place on the earth. And you don't have to be Dr. Einstein to work out what happened in between. Now the problem is reversed. Now we have our last castle of the European Union, and we are afraid that all the people from all the countries we used to rule and that we're still bombing and invading and occupying are going to get on boats and come here. There was an amazing vignette I saw from Nice on television last night. A Muslim woman had gone to pay her respects to the dead in the latest atrocity that took place there. A Frenchman told her she should be ashamed of herself and she should go home. And she answered, "But monsieur, this is my home. I was born in France." He was momentarily speechless. And then he said, "Then you are a shame on France." This kind of racism is deep in the bones and character of the European societies, because for centuries they have enjoyed the position of top dog, able to go anywhere, do anything, steal anything from anybody. And now that position is reversing. And that's why you get ever increasing racism. Racism in Belgium or France or Germany or the Netherlands has nothing to do with the fact that Britain decided to leave the European Union. It was all happening when we were in the European Union, and we're still in it. We haven't left it yet. Racism in Britain is exactly the same, except, and this is an important point, racism in Britain is less than it is on the European mainland. It's a well-known phrase and saying, if you think England's racist, you've never lived in France. And that's a fact. So let's deal with the racists in our midst. Let's struggle relentlessly against them in every possible way. But let's not inflate it or exaggerate it to score points in favour of remaining in the European Union, which sadly is what some people are doing. Gentleman in the middle.
مرحبا بك سيد جورج، أنا إعلامي أحمد القحطاني من بريطانيا.
أهلا وسهلا.
أهلا وسهلا بك. حقيقة الزلزال الذي دوى في أوروبا وفي بريطانيا تحديدا، خروج بريطانيا من الاتحاد الأوروبي والكلام الكثير الذي سمعناه من قبل الكثير. سؤالي هنا تحديدا في هذا الجانب، أن بريطانيا هل تواجه صعوبة، هل هي مستعدة بالحقيقة تواجه الصعوبة بعد الخروج من الاتحاد الأوروبي، أم إنها يعني كيف ممكن أن تتجاوز الصعوبات التي ربما بعد الخروج اللي هو ربما يكون بعد سنتين؟
They said that the sky would fall in. They said the pound would crash. They said the stock market would crash. They said we'd be fighting in the streets. But none of that actually happened. The pound fell and then rose again. The stock market fell and then rose again. And now it's at record highs. Capitalism is a very flexible beast, and its only interest is money. It's not interested remotely what flag you're flying, what union you're in, or what union you left. Can money be made in Britain from our 65 million population, from our name in the world as a trading nation? Can our people be of service to the corporations and the businesses? And of course the answer to all of those things is positive, and yes. And so none of the predictions that were made have come to pass, and none of the so-called promises, as you know, I was a campaigner for leaving, but I wasn't one of the official campaign. I wasn't one of the leaders. They were all chosen from the elite. It was one section of the elite against the other section of the elite. So I never made anybody any promises. So I never broke any promises. But the leaders of the exit campaign made many promises, and they've broken them all. Because for me, it was never about what we could do with the £350 million that we send every week to the European Union, because I knew that it would be a long time before we saw any of that money. And when we did see it, we'd have to win an argument in Britain that it should be spent on this or that, as we do with every pound of every piece of expenditure. The British Parliament just decided this week to spend £200 billion on more nuclear weapons. This is insanity. And we would have taken that decision whether we were in the European Union or out of it. But if we get the right kind of government, I don't mean right, I mean left kind of government, a Jeremy Corbyn government, we can scrap this meaningless waste of money. We can do many things, but that's much further down the road. For me, it was about taking back control of our own affairs so that we can do good things or we can do bad things. But at least it'll be us that is electing the people who make the decisions to do those good or bad things. And if they do bad things, we can remove them. There's much more of this after the break. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London. We're discussing what happens next now that Britain has made its momentous decision to Brexit, to exit the European Union. We took the كلمة camera out onto the streets of London to hear the voice of the people. Well, some of them. Let's hear what they said.
Will there be a rise of racism and hatred in Europe after the UK leaves?
Yes, it could be.
Yeah, possibly, but I don't think it's right though.
I think we've already seen it at the Polish Centre in Hammersmith, where they were putting racist stuff on the walls, so I think it started already.
There will be a rise, but there will be a lot of people who will not stand for it as well.
After the UK leaves the EU, will there be a rise of racism and hatred in Europe?
I guess yes, because we have seen some incidents like that in the news and on the media, so I guess yes.
I really hope not, and I think we all have to try really hard to make sure that's not the case. There is a chance, but I think we have to work together to make sure that doesn't happen.
Will there be a rise of racism and hatred in Europe after the UK leaves?
Yeah, I personally think there will be. I think it's come up to boiling point, and I think it's become, I mean, with no chance of the second referendum in the UK, I do think it will exacerbate tensions throughout Europe.
Possibly. I think it will be limited, though, to people who had inclinations in that direction already. I don't think the fact of leaving is going to create new racism. I think it's just going to allow some people to feel it's legitimate to express what they've already thought.
Well, rather a sensible clutch of members of the public there. Let me deal with some of the points that were made. It's a silly question, if I may say so, about whether racism will rise in Europe because Britain left the European Union. I mean, if you think about it, that's actually not a logical question. If there's racism in Europe, it's there whether we are in the European Union or not, and I hope in my opening remarks I've made it clear not only that racism exists in Europe, but why it exists and how long it has existed, and that will be entirely unaffected by Britain leaving. A more legitimate question is whether there will be a rise in racism in Britain because we've left the European Union, and I agree with the gentleman who just spoke that, of course, there's always a risk of a rise in racism, whether we left or whether we stayed. In fact, the real racists in Britain were hoping for a very narrow majority to remain, because that would have actually been the perfect conditions for increased inflammatory and incendiary remarks. Look, we have some 7 or 8 million people of colour in Britain. They will always be regarded by some sections of the British population as somehow alien, that shouldn't be here, some kind of threat to us and our way of life. But my experience as the father of, by the grace of God, many young children, is that young children and young people are the least racist that have ever lived in this country, and I've lived in it for a very long time. Racism was absolutely commonplace when I was growing up in the place where I grew up, where there were no people of colour at all. Everybody was white. And there it was hatred by Protestants of Catholics. Even though we were all white, and even though we were all Christians, we had to somehow be divided, somehow be stratified. But racism was off the map. You used words about people of colour as a matter of course. You had thoughts about people of colour as a matter of course. This was absolutely endemic amongst all classes and all people. That's not the case now. Certainly in London. In London, the number of people with friends of different ethnicities, my youngest child had his 2nd birthday party just at the weekend. There were black people, white people, Asian people, European people, Latin American people, people in hijabs, people not, Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Christians, Catholics, Protestants. It was the most extraordinary array of guests at a birthday party, and I sat there in wonder and thought back to my own childhood, where every person that would have been at my 2nd birthday party would have been white and would have been a Roman Catholic. There would have been nobody else there. So I believe we've moved a very, very long way in the last decades, and I believe we'll continue to move in that direction. Yes, madam, please come back.
I mean, because the question that was given to people, and the question I asked you before about racism, we all know racism's always been there, but the reason I'm asking this is because there are so many and thousands of people in the UK who are very uneducated, don't like to see other backgrounds, other cultures. They still have this racism because the UK was a great and strong country in the EU. So many people think with the UK, leaving the EU would make them feel in a way stronger or different or better than the rest of the countries. Some people think the EU is stronger with the UK in it, but that's why, and one of the reasons I think racism will.
Well, there's no evidence of it. It was widely predicted by liberal opponents of leaving the European Union. One lunatic I saw, he happens to be an old friend of mine, said that Britain would now become in the grip of a national pogrom. But actually, out on the streets, there is exactly the same level of racist attacks as there has ever been. They are at a low level. They are, of course, at a giant level if you're the victim of them. But the police and the statistics are clear. There has been no spike in racist incidents. There has been a spike of people claiming that someone shouted a bad word at them or called them something on Twitter. But frankly, that's not serious racism. Serious racism is when your person, your property is attacked, or when you fear your person or your property is going to be attacked, and you have a legitimate grounds for that fear. And that doesn't exist at the moment. There are, I don't know how many people in Britain that are racist. I know that there are many millions of people who are prey to racists. They're prey for this reason. the indigenous, let's call them, white, British, working class, have been neglected and abandoned for decades in this country. And as they have seen their life chances diminish, they are prey to the evil that says, you know the reason why your son can't get a decent school, why your teenage girl can't get a job, why your newly married children can't get a house, is not because of the political class that have abandoned the working people. It's because of you or you or you of different color who have a community, who have a small business, who run a corner shop or whatever. There are millions of people in danger of being lured onto those rocks, and that's always been the case. But the people to blame are the people who neglected and abandoned the workers in the first place. Now, let me give you an example. Might not mean much in Beirut when this gets shown. There's an area of London called Dagenham. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a Ford motor plant employing 25,000 people. Every worker was in a trade union and earning good money. And every worker had a house provided by the local council, and a community centre, and a swimming pool, and gardens, and parks. And now all of those things have gone. The white workers have been left completely abandoned. So some of them are going to blame the black people who did nothing to them, who had no part in their abandonment. It's our job, those of us who don't think that way, to educate those people as to who the real culprits are. And they're not Mr. Ali, who runs a corner shop, or Mr. Abdul, who serves in the local curry shop. One of the many funny things about Britain is that all the racists eat Indian food every Friday and Saturday night. And if they've got enough money, they go to the beach in Spain and lie there trying to look as brown as possible when they come home. Racism's a funny thing. By the way, it doesn't just exist in Europe. I don't know if you're from the Indian subcontinent, your heritage. There's racism in India. In fact, there's racism on India that ends up in pogrom. There's racism in Africa. There, in Rwanda, the Hutus and the Tutsis are never done attacking each other, and quite recently massacred each other. There's racism in the Arab world. There's racism in America. The whole country is on the cusp of chaos over racism. So this is not just a European problem, it's a human problem. Don't you think?
I do think so, because I'm not talking about racism from white people or European people only. It could be from French, Moroccan or Algerian person in Paris or in France, or it could be from an Indian, Pakistani, Arab in London towards a white person or a black person.
Well, I'll tell you one thing we have here that most viewers watching this will not understand. We have a problem of racial violence between black people in Britain, born in Britain, of African heritage, and black people born in Britain of Afro-Caribbean heritage. Some of them murder each other over whether you're from Jamaica or whether you're from Africa. This is almost impossible for me to calculate, but it exists. So racism exists. But race is not the only issue that emerges from the Brexit, the European Union debate. So maybe we should move on a little bit. Would you like to speak, sir? Yes, please.
Assalamu alaikum, George.
Walaikum salam.
Just want to just add a point, try and make it quick. I heard that, I'm not sure if I got my facts completely right here, but something to do with Turkey being one of the very few countries that are not in debt or something, and whether this, the problems that Turkey is in now, whether this is having an implication on why things are happening with the way they are, with what's happening there now? Is it part of the reason of the chaos in Turkey?
The existence of plots and conspiracies against countries that are Muslim and strong is well enough attested to. We know that there are people who cannot accept that any Muslim country can be strong, can be powerful, and can be rich. And so any Muslim country that is can expect interference. The bad news is that even poor Muslim countries get the same kind of interference. I don't know if the brother next to you is from Somalia, but I happen to know Somalia quite well. And here is a country that almost could hardly get any poorer, but all the regional powers and their superpower backers are all still involved in conspiracies and intrigues in Somalia. So you get done over if you're rich, but you also get done over if you're not rich. The only answer is to make yourselves internally so strong that no one can succeed in their plots against you. There'll be much more of this after the break. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, where, of course, the British people have just in the last few weeks made the momentous decision to withdraw from the European Union, with consequences, some easily foreseeable, some as yet unknown. Or as Donald Rumsfeld once put it, there are unknown unknowns in this picture, and we're trying to explore some of them here this evening. But we took the كلمة camera out onto the glorious streets of London to hear what the people thought. Have a listen to this.
Are the foreign investments at risk of slowing down?
Well, yes, because the pound is going down, so I would say yes.
I think we have heard that companies like Lush are planning to move out, so it's a bit difficult to know what exactly will happen. But some of them are going to leave, I think.
Probably, but that may rise again in the future.
They might slow down in the future.
Are the foreign investment at risk of slowing down?
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. I mean, uncertainty is never very good for investment. On the other hand, the pound isn't worth what it was, and so there's opportunities for companies to come and buy up British companies. So, you know, it could be one way and then the other way. So in the longer term, I think it'll even out.
That's hard to say, except we know that markets don't like uncertainty, and right now the UK is going through a period of transition and change, and we can expect the financial markets not to respond well to that.
Will the economy of the EU face financial crisis as it would in the UK?
I think both UK and EU, but I think UK may face a bit more.
It wouldn't unless other countries come out.
I think the EU is strong enough to weather it, but I think it's the UK that might find it a bit difficult because now we're standing alone.
I'm not sure. We will have to see what happens there. I'm not sure.
It will be a period of massive change, and it will be difficult to predict. Again, we have to work together, and I think the current government has to work in a conciliatory and supportive manner with the EU to make sure that we have a continued dialogue and we don't end up damaging each other's mutual best interests.
Well, you can be sure they won't damage each other's mutual interests. As I said earlier, well, there's a buck to be made. They'll all continue to make it. The one point I would demur from the vox pops there is the idea that Britain is standing alone. 137 countries in the world are not members of the European Union. So we're no more standing alone than any of those 137 countries. I argue we've left the European Union and we've rejoined the world. which is a much bigger oyster, actually. The European Union is a failing collection of European economies, all of which are in one kind of trouble or another. Even Germany, Deutsche Bank just announced the closure of more than 400 branches just in the last few days. So, let's hear from, yes, gentleman in the middle.
نعم سيد جورج، في نفس السياق نتحدث عن قضية الاستفتاء الذي أفتوا عليه، وربما هناك استفتاء آخر سوف يكون في بريطانيا حول قضية الخروج أو دخول بريطانيا أو عدم أو دخول بريطانيا في الاتحاد. تعتقد الآن الاستفتاء هو تقريبا 4 مليون شخص وقع على هذه العريضة وأعطيت إلى البرلمان. هل البرلمان يأخذ بعين الاعتبار هذه الأصوات؟
Well, 2 million people signed it, not 4, and 77,000 of those gave their address as Vatican City, where only 1,300 people actually live. This is now widely discredited petition that was got up by the supporters of the European Union. In any case, you don't have to look at a petition, you can look at the results of the referendum. As I said earlier, 17.25 million people in Britain voted to leave, and that's it. In a democracy, you can't keep having an election until you get the result that you want. So that decision is final, and no party, neither Conservative nor Labour, are going to try to countermand the decision of the referendum. For to do so would be a very, very dangerous and risky business indeed. Then we'd really have trouble on the streets of Britain if that were to be tried. Who else would like to contribute? Anyone else here in the front? Middle? Yes, gentleman in the middle row there.
Hi, I just wanted to challenge, actually, if you could elaborate on some of the claims that you made earlier about, one, the recent racist attack, for example, the two in Birmingham over the last 2 days, the taxi attack and the little 4-year-old girl, and how, if there hasn't been a rise of racism, why such attacks have increased.
But they haven't increased.
But things like that have happened, 2 attacks in the last 2 days in Birmingham.
Again, you have the delightful difficulty in this of being young. There have been racial murders in Birmingham. One old man was decapitated on his way back from mosque in Birmingham just less than 2 years ago. Another group of men in 2011 had a car driven at them when they were guarding Muslim property in Birmingham and mown down, several murdered. There are racist attacks in Britain all the time. There have always been. It has nothing to do with voting to leave the European Union. Now, I made the point earlier, there has been an increase in the number of people saying they've been insulted on Twitter. But forgive me, as someone who's threatened with death on Twitter every single day, I don't regard that as a particularly serious problem. I wish it wasn't happening, but it does. But there has not been an increase. Let me say this unequivocally. There has been no increase in physical attacks on black and minority ethnic people in Britain since we voted to leave the European Union. That's just simply false. Go ahead. Okay,
another point that I was wondering if you could elaborate on was your claims about the UK not being economically affected. The pound has crashed and it's still quite low compared to how it was before.
It's a good thing.
And Barclays was stopped from trading. So
Barclays what?
Was withheld from trading, if I recall correctly.
No, you don't. You don't recall correctly. Barclays is still open for business and doing a rolling trade.
Sorry. It was stopped for trading. It's now back on the market, but it was stopped in the past because of how volatile the market was.
What do you mean? Shares in Barclays?
Yeah. They stopped trading.
That's completely untrue.
They stopped.
I'm sorry.
It was.
You're in possession of incorrect facts. Barclays has never stopped trading or ever been stopped from trading. Shares in Barclays have never stopped being bought and sold, and Barclays is still doing a roaring trade. But let me tell you something that you might not like to hear. I don't give a toss about Barclays. I don't give a toss about the City of London and share dealers and hedge funds and all the other paraphernalia that passes for economics in the casino of the City of London. That isn't economics. In fact, one of our major problems in Britain is the extent to which we have become entirely dependent on a gang of croupiers and gamblers in the City of London at the expense of the real economy. When I was your age, we had a car industry, a bus industry, a truck industry, a shipbuilding industry, a steel industry, a coal industry. We manufactured much of the world's goods, and we sailed them in our own ships that we made ourselves across the 7 seas. And made in England, made in Britain, meant something. That's economy. Not a group of guys rigging the LIBOR rate at Barclays. You want to talk to me about Barclays? I think half them should be in jail. Half the leadership of Barclays Bank should be in prison. In fact, quite a few of them now are, and maybe more are to come. So, first of all, the pound didn't crash. It is lower than it was, but it didn't crash. And it's a good thing when the value of the pound comes down, not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you've got a lot of pounds. Well, frankly, most people in Britain don't have a lot of pounds. It's a good thing if you're trying to manufacture and export your goods, because they're suddenly cheaper for people in the world to buy. And that's what we want. The pound was far too high. So these swellings and contractions, as you heard one of the people in the street say, these swellings and contractions of the capitalist economies will continue. They'll go up and they'll go down. I was in Parliament in a time where Britain was in a perpetual cycle of boom and bust. First we boomed and then we bust, and we're still bust now. We were bust before we left the European Union. We would have been bust whether we left it or we didn't leave it. We are still not out of the Great Recession of 2008. You know that average earnings in Britain have not risen for almost 10 years. The workers are still earning, in real terms, what they were earning 10 years ago. There are millions of working people in Britain who haven't had a single wage increase, not one single wage increase, in the last 8 years. Please, come back.
Okay, so your comments about the UK being, I mean, as the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, as you've mentioned earlier, just to clarify and make sure I understand correctly, you're suggesting that you want to take our economy back to the stages where we were manufacturing and increase the manufacturing output, as opposed to the financial industry, which is now huge in the world.
You call it back to, I say forward to. That's the only difference between us. I want an economy where we make things. You see, it's not the case that we don't need things made. If you look around this studio now, or go outside and look around you, the environment is filled with things that were made. The problem is, they weren't made here. They were made somewhere else. We need things. And we need to get ourselves back into a position where we're amongst the people making them. And I believe that we've still got a name and a reputation for quality that is a sellable commodity on the international market. And now that we're no longer in the EU, we will more easily be able to sell into those markets that are rising, rather than be shackled to an economy, a set of economies in the European Union that are sinking. Last one.
So, yeah, okay, just to comment on that then. So since we've left the EU, agricultural grants grants from the EU will now be stopped. And that obviously played a huge role in our economy, in the manufacturing or selling to the rest of the world. So you suggesting that we go back to manufacturing when we don't have the resources necessarily to produce the output of manufacturing that, say, countries like China and India are able to. How would you counteract?
China produces its own capital.
Which is what all of this comes from.
The Chinese state decides, I'm going to issue a credit note to build a new high-speed railway. It doesn't go touting around the international banks for loans at punitive rates of interest. The state is a player in the economy. I don't understand your agricultural point. Britain's agriculture is an infinitesimally small part of the British economy, and most grants from the European Union were corrupt bribes to farmers intended mainly for farmers in France so that they could overproduce and then dump their produce on the agricultural economies of poor and struggling countries that were trying to survive. Young lady again.
To manufacture things, I believe we can get all the resources, we do have them, but it's the cost. That's why so many businesses prefer to outsource and import, stuff or things to use in order to sell them, in order to make money. How has
that changed from being in the European Union?
No, that's not relevant. I'm just saying, how would the cost be managed? To manufacture, for Britain to be able to manufacture in whatever industry at a low cost, so it allows people.
You're talking about price, the price of the product. Oh yeah, that's a fair point.
Cost of manufacturing.
No, well, we can't compete with Bhutan in terms of price, but we can compete with Bhutan in terms of quality, in terms of reliability, in terms of our ability to make good things. And we did. You know, again, I keep saying this like I'm a very old man, but when I was your age, if you went to Africa or Asia, if you saw a bus or a truck or a motorbike or a car coming towards you, there was a very high chance that it had been made in Britain. We threw all that away, partly because we pursued the casino economics of finance capitalism in the Anglo-American model, and we need to reverse that. We need to be able to make things that are not going to be as cheap as Bhutan or Bangladesh, but are going to be much, much better, and are going to have a certain, as the French say, je ne sais quoi about them. We once did. Long before you were born, in the 1960s, London was the capital of the whole world. Everyone looked to London. Be right back. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, for Al-Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing Europe, Britain's role within and without it, and what that means for the world. Let's take the gentleman in the middle. Yes, sir.
نعم سيدي. بخصوص محور الاتحاد، طبعا محور آخر ولكن في نفس السياق، الاتحاد الأوروبي وقضية تركيا. حقيقة تركيا تكلمت كثير أنها سوف تدخل الاتحاد الأوروبي، وربما الاتحاد الأوروبي والبرلمان الأوروبي بعيد يغرد في مكان وهي تغرد في مكان. ماذا تتوقع؟ هل تركيا تدخل في الاتحاد الأوروبي، وخصوصا أن أردوغان وحكومة أردوغان تدخلت بشكل سافر في قضية سوريا ودعم داعش والمجاميع الإرهابية اللي موجودة في سوريا، اللي موجودة في تركيا، ومن خلال تركيا أيضا دخلت إلى سوريا. هل ستدخل الاتحاد الأوروبي؟
The British government under David Cameron was a very strong supporter of Turkish membership of the EU. The German government and other governments, the Austrian government for ancient and historic reasons, and many others, are strongly against it. So I would very much doubt whether the European Union will allow Turkey to join, especially now that Britain has left, because Britain was Turkey's biggest supporter in terms of membership. Moreover, I cannot imagine why Turkey would want to join the European Union, especially after recent events in Turkey, when the existence of Western plotting, Western-assisted plotting against the government of Turkey is clear if you've got eyes to see. NATO took 7 hours to say one word against the attempted coup d'etat in Turkey, which their silence spoke volumes. So I can't imagine why Turkey would want to, and I don't think that the European Union will allow Turkey to join. Turkey is too big, it's too Muslim, and it is too fresh in the minds of other European Union countries that are closer to it geographically for that ever to work. Germany has already accepted 1 million refugees, mainly from Syria and Iraq, and the country is politically at breaking point over it. The idea of free movement of labour, of tens of millions of Turkish workers into Germany, which is where most of them would go, is inconceivable to me. So my answer would be there's no chance of Turkey joining the European Union, and neither should it. Yes, gentleman at the end, in the middle.
I agree with you that moving to manufacturing wouldn't necessarily be a step backwards. However, what is definitely a step forwards is technology and services, which London has held down for the UK for a very long time. Would moving to your economics of manufacturing keep the services in the city of tech and finance and services floated, or will we lose them to Europe? And how would we actually recover from that? Because we're not moving with the
I'm with you on that, and I had recent experience of the fintech industry, which has grown up in London and is something to behold. Truly phenomenal, mainly fueled by the expertise, brilliance actually, of young people. And those services, financial services, will still be on offer in London. I believe it would be foolish and short-sighted of people to abandon London in this sector because we had left the European Union, because we left the European Union and we rejoined the whole world. And the whole world is a much bigger economy than the European Union. Go ahead.
I meant as in if we do follow your idea of economics and supporting manufacturing a lot more, like you said, via the state, I'm assuming you would use it. How do we actually support finance and not lose it? Because I agree with you.
Well, I don't think finance needs any support. None of these fintech companies needed very much in the way of support. They generate their own wealth. They set up a company with a couple of guys or women in a garage, and before long there are people paying billions of pounds for it, even before it's made a profit. So the very essence of these kind of companies is that they are self-starting. They are built around the brilliance of young people, young individuals. So, of course, you want a helpful environment. If I had been the Mayor of London, I would have provided one. But you don't need state investment in such companies. Indeed, state investment is probably a bad idea in such companies, would probably hold them back. I say again, look around you. Everything here was made somewhere. Every service that we partake of today is provided by someone, somewhere. The problem is increasingly fewer of the things that are made and the services that are produced are made here in Britain, and that's what we need to change. From what I've seen in the Shoreditch corridor, in the sector of London that is phenomenally successful, there is no need at all why that should change just because we left the European Union. Yes, sir.
Yeah, just wanted to add, in terms of manufacturing, I think a lot of people are just misled about UK not having any sort of ability to create or engineer. But we were really the masters of it, and that's what people tend to forget. We still manufacture great cars, and we manufacture, let's say, sometimes the hyper-luxury products. So you see stuff like £1 million Aston Martins now. Yes, it is a better product, don't get it twisted, and it does serve, let's say, some of the rich. Even things like British Hi-Fi is a lot better than world Hi-Fi, like Name, Braga, Genesis. These are all brands which are British made, British built, British manufactured, and all very, very good. And they'll beat pretty much any electronics from around the world, if you've ever heard of them or even heard their products. I mean, we make some of the best stuff, and I think people, especially young people, have not really been taught this or understand that we actually hold some of the best brands in the world.
Well, that's perfect. You need to write that up and give it to me so I can use it as my own in a speech somewhere. That was a brilliant contribution. Look, the whole debate around the European Union was built around a group of people telling us that we were not good enough to be independent of the European Union, that we were yesterday. But I don't believe that at all. And this discussion tonight, you, the two young men behind you, and we have got fantastic talent in this country with a world view and who came from the world. Your parents, your grandparents. You weren't born, you were born here, but your parents and grandparents probably weren't. So we're very lucky that we have emerged with the multi-ethnic, multi-talented, multi-faith society that we've got. Contained, we have some of the best universities in the world. We have at least 4 or 5 of the world's best universities, and many more that are of world ranking. We have, as we've just been discussing, a fintech industry, which is something to be proud of. And we have out there in the country millions of people just bursting for an opportunity. What we don't have is a government that is ready to give them that opportunity.
Yes.
Let's hear from the young man.
One more small point. As with the
okay.
racism, just want to just add, again, with young people, don't be fearful. I mean, I'm from Luton, where racism, where EDL and BNP and things like this were pretty much invented. And I lived on the same roads as these people. There was as many, well, more English people that helped in times of need than there was, you know, than there wasn't, let's say. So this inner fear people have of racism, of leaving the EU and this and that, it really doesn't exist here at all. Again, I agree, it's more...
Well, it's nothing like
it's
here.
It's worse in France and Germany.
Here, there is no fascism here. The fascist organizations, the EDL and the BNP, are minuscule and collapsing. In France, they're competing to be president of the Republic. In many European countries, fascism is a mass political force. It isn't here. So let's not talk ourselves down. Running out of time. Gentleman at the middle.
Just to question, so to clarify what I mentioned earlier about the EU, the grants that we received made our cost of manufacturing cheaper, which made us more appealing to an international market. Post-Brexit, our pound has fallen, which may have made us more attractive, but then again, our imports then increase in value. They cost more. With countries like China, who have a massive manufacturing industry, we're seeing their climate completely destroyed. How will the effects of leaving the EU and affect our imports and exports? I know you're saying you want to move towards a manufacturing-based economy, but wouldn't that be more detrimental to the future of the United Kingdom?
No. If it did, I wouldn't want it.
But as a youth who's more inclined to cheaper prices than a brand, as the gentleman mentioned... And
you'll grow out of that.
Again, I would much rather...
Trust me, you'll want an Aston Martin.
Of course, I would much rather prefer an Aston Martin, but as you mentioned, wages haven't changed. So we can't afford an Aston Martin. We can barely afford to buy a house. I mean, with the increases now in manufacturing, if we were to increase, the prices will definitely increase. That will affect us more than ever before.
Well, the head of the Remain campaign, Sir Rose, what's his first name? Michael Rose, I think. He admitted in front of Parliament that one of the first effects of leaving the European Union will be that wages will rise. And hallelujah. And the reason that wages will rise is because there'll no longer be the automatic right, my apologies to any in the audience that this affects, there will no longer be the automatic right of everybody in Bulgaria, everybody in Hungary, everybody in Poland, to come and join the labour market here, putting pressure on wages and conditions, and that will end. It will end quite soon. I hope our friends will still be here. Every European Union citizen here now should be allowed to stay, but we can not go into the future with the possibility of 350 million people joining the labour market here. That's just not sensible economics. I'm running fast out of time. I wanted to hear from you, sir.
I was just curious about, because you said about how some other countries will also want to leave the EU.
Yeah.
How long do you think the EU has left?
I think the EU as we know it will not exist in the next 10 years because it is intrinsically a bad idea to shackle together widely divergent economies with a single currency. The one good thing that Gordon Brown did as Chancellor of the Exchequer, not one, he did more than one, but the best thing he did was keep us out of the euro. Because you cannot have a single currency with a single bank, with a single interest rate, governing the economy of places as divergent as Germany and, with all respect, Slovakia or Bulgaria. These are too widely different to be accommodated within that system. The hourly wage in Bulgaria is £1 or £2 an hour. So that's vastly different from the German economy, where the hourly wage is 15 to 20 euros per hour. You cannot manage with one gear stick such widely divergent vehicles. So that will begin to break apart. Southern Europe and places in East and Central Europe will have to get out of this bind. At the same time, see, the European Union worked quite well when it was a small group of very rich countries with very similar economies. When the European Union was Germany, France, Belgium, Holland, Luxembourg, that can work. You can have a single currency in 5 or 6 countries where the economic standards, levels of prosperity are roughly in common. But once you've got Germany and Slovakia, that doesn't any longer compute. So I believe that the European Union as we know it will not exist in 10 years. That doesn't mean we're all going to become enemies of each other, or that we're not going to sell things to each other, that we're not going to cooperate with each other on all kinds of things, from the environment to crime, terrorism, and so on. We all have a common interest in them. But what we can't have is countries being told what they can and can't do by other countries. We need an independent, democratic, neutral Britain. We don't need nuclear weapons. We shouldn't be invading other people's countries and occupying them. And we shouldn't be supporting terrorism in other people's countries, then complaining when terrorism comes back to bite us. But that leads me on to other matters, and it's probably better if I say goodnight to all of you now, and thanks for being with me. I'm George Galloway. This was كلمة. This is Al Mayadeen Television.